His caboose glowed white at night, lit by the remains of the missing. In 1893, a train crashed in the desolate Utah wilderness. Amid the wreckage, one engineer survived, and what he did next would haunt the earth forever. He took the bones of the dead passengers and transformed them into lamps that flickered with an eerie, unnatural glow. His caboose, lit by the remains of the forgotten, burned white at night, casting shadows of the lost souls. But what seemed like a twisted attempt at survival was, in truth, a doorway to something far darker, a haunting that would never be forgotten. The storm was relentless that night, howling across the barren Utah plains like some beast searching for its prey. The train thundered along the tracks, its wheels screeching as they fought against the driving rain. Inside, the engineer, Nathaniel Cooper, gripped the controls with both hands. Sweat dripped down his brow despite the cold. His heart pounded in his chest as the wind battered the windows like fists pounding at a door. He had seen storms like this before, but never one quite so fierce, never one that felt so personal. "Stay focused," Nathaniel muttered to himself, tightening his grip. But the storm didn't care for his determination. It howled louder, its fury growing with every passing second. The lights flickered in the engine room. The steel tracks, slick with rain, seemed to stretch on forever, as if the earth itself were trying to swallow the train whole. Suddenly, there was a sharp, metallic screeching noise that made Nathaniel's blood run cold. The train lurched forward violently. A sickening, heart-stopping sensation washed over him. For a moment, he couldn't tell if it was the storm or the train itself fighting against the inevitable. A flash of lightning lit the night sky, illuminating the twisted tracks ahead. The bridge up ahead had forgotten to check it earlier. The thought hit him like a ton of bricks. "Hold on!" he screamed, but it was already too late. The train had already made its fatal choice. The world tilted as the tracks crumbled beneath them, sending the train careening into the abyss. The thunder that followed was deafening, like the heavens themselves were tearing apart. Everything, time, space, and reason faded into an endless blur of metal, fire, and darkness, and then silence. When Nathaniel finally regained his senses, he was lying among the wreckage, his body aching in places he hadn't known could hurt. His head throbbed, and he tasted the metallic tang of blood in his mouth. But he was alive. Somehow, impossibly, he had survived. The train, though, was gone. He staggered to his feet, the night air cold against his skin. The wreckage stretched out before him, a twisted mass of shattered metal and broken bodies. The screams of the dying had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. Nathaniel's breath came out in ragged gasps, his mind struggling to process the scene. Around him there was nothing but darkness, the storm having subsided into a haunting stillness. His chest tightened, panic creeping in. His eyes darted over the wreckage, searching for any signs of life. He called out, "Hello? Is anyone?" But his words were swallowed by the void. No reply. He took a hesitant step forward, his boots crunching against the shattered glass beneath him. He walked among the twisted bodies of the passengers, their faces contorted in grotesque expressions of pain. He felt sick, like he was intruding on something private, something deeply personal. Then, something caught his eye bones. He froze. At first, he thought it was just another part of the wreckage, but as he drew closer, he saw it for what it was, a pile of bones scattered in the dirt. The bodies of the passengers had been torn apart, but it wasn't just the wreck that had left them this way. Nathaniel's breath hitched. There was no one left, no survivors, only the dead, their identities erased by the violent nature of the crash. "God," he whispered, his voice breaking as he turned away, desperate to rid himself of the horrific sight. He staggered back, stumbling over the jagged remnants of the train. The rain had stopped, leaving only the sound of his own breath, harsh in the stillness. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the faintest scent of something strange, something that smelled wrong. He knew, in that moment, he had to do something. But what? What could he possibly do for these poor souls who had already been forgotten by fate? He looked around, his gaze landing on the wrecked remains of the train carriages. A twisted thought flickered in his mind. It was insane. The bones, the dead passengers had been reduced to nothing more than a pile of remnants, stripped of everything that had made them human. Wasn't there some way to use them? His hands trembled as he approached the pile. Had seen this kind of destruction before, but had never been so close to it, so personally connected to it. The crash had taken everything from these people, their lives, their names, their memories, and now it was taking their remains as well. But Nathaniel's mind refused to accept that. He couldn't just leave them here to be forgotten. Couldn't let them become nothing more than scattered bones in a storm. And so, the idea took root. slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, but then it began to grow. What if there was a way to use the bones, to honor them somehow, to keep them from being erased entirely from existence? His eyes shifted to the wreckage of the train. He could use what remained, the broken machinery, the scattered parts of the train. He could make something. A lamp made from the remains of the dead, to shine in their memory, to keep them from fading into the abyss of the forgotten. It was madness, but it was the only thought that made any sense, the only way to stave off the crushing silence. And so, Nathaniel set to work, his hands shaking as he began the gruesome task of gathering the bones. But what he didn't know, what no one could have foreseen, was that this choice, this twisted, desperate act would be the catalyst for something far worse than anything he could imagine. But that, of course, was just the beginning. The hours bled into days. Nathaniel had no way of telling time. There were no clocks, no signals, just the unrelenting wilderness around him. He had always considered himself a survivor, but now, as the landscape stretched out endlessly before him, he realized that survival was no longer just a matter of physical endurance. It was about something darker, something far more unsettling. He was alone. There had been no rescuers, no search parties. No one came. The night after the crash, the air had been thick with the scent of burning wood and metal, but the wind had eventually carried it all away, leaving only silence. His stomach rumbled with hunger, but he couldn't bring himself to leave the wreckage. What was left to live for? What was left to remember? He had buried the passengers at least. What was left of them but the bones remained? The bones he had turned into lamps. Their hollow shapes were now spread out around the wreckage, casting a cold, ghostly glow against the dark. They were no longer just remains. They had become a part of the night, a part of him. The lamps flickered in the eerie silence. At first, the light had offered him warmth, comfort even. Ed convinced himself that it was a fitting tribute to the dead, a way to make sure they wouldn't be forgotten. But over time, the light began to feel less like a beacon of survival and more like an unholy reminder of what he had done. Every night, as he sat alone by the flickering lamps, he couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, like the wind, soft, distant murmurs that Nathaniel couldn't quite make out. He told himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him, the result of isolation and the long days of grief. But the whispers grew louder, and they became more distinct. They weren't random sounds, they were words, names that Nathaniel had never heard before. He was sitting by the light of the lamps one evening, feeling the cold gnawing at his bones when he first caught it, a voice clear and unmistakable. "Don't forget us." The words were soft, almost gentle, but in the dead of night, in the empty wasteland of Utah, they struck him like a lightning bolt. He jerked back, the lamp he was holding falling from his hands and smashing against the rocks. His heart pounded in his chest. "Who's there?" he demanded, but there was no response. The silence swallowed his words. He stood, his legs unsteady beneath him. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold, and for the first time in days, he felt truly afraid. The voices came again, more insistent this time. "Remember us." Nathaniel took a trembling step toward the pile of bones he had used to make the lamps. The air around him seemed to crackle with an unnatural energy. The flickering flames from the lamps cast long, eerie shadows on the wreckage. His skin crawled, but he couldn't turn away. The air grew thicker, like something unseen was watching him. "Remember us." The voices were coming from the lamps themselves. His pulse quickened as the light from the bones grew brighter, almost blinding. His thoughts raced. He couldn't explain it. What was happening? Was it a hallucination? Had the isolation finally taken its toll on his mind? But deep down, he knew it wasn't just his mind. The air smelled different now, warmer, thicker, charged with a terrible weight. And the lampsto's damned lamps were somehow connected to it, connected to them. As he reached toward the nearest lamp, he noticed something he hadn't before. The bones weren't just lighting up. They were alive, not alive in the sense that they were moving, but alive in the sense that they had a presence, an energy, an unnatural force. The lamp in his hand flickered violently, casting harsh shadows around him, and then it dimmed. In that moment, Nathaniel felt something heavy and suffocating pressing against him from all sides. He gasped, struggling to breathe, his chest tightening as if invisible hands were squeezing the life out of him. He dropped the lamp in horror, backing away. The flame sputtered and died, leaving nothing but cold darkness. The silence returned, but now it felt worse. It felt oppressive. The air itself seemed to be waiting for something. Nathaniel's mind was racing. Had he made a mistake? Could these spirits be real? Were the bones truly alive? He couldn't bring himself to understand it, but there was something he knew with horrifying certainty. The dead passengers weren't just forgotten. They were waiting, they were reaching out, and they were angry. As the days passed, the whispers grew more frequent, more desperate. The lamps seemed to grow stronger. With every night that passed, their glow grew brighter, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. Nathaniel could no longer sleep without hearing the faint calls of the forgotten passengers. It was as if their souls had merged with the bones, becoming something else entirely, something vengeful. He had tried to leave. He had tried to run to escape the endless gnawing pull of the wreckage, but the moment he stepped away from the crash site, the voices stopped. It was as if the spirits were bound to that place, bound to their bones and their lamps. The moment he left, they went silent. He couldn't bear it. But it wasn't the silence that terrified him. No, it was the other thing that had been creeping into his mind as the days wore on. What if the spirits weren't asking to be remembered? What if they were demanding something else? Nathaniel turned to look at the lamps, their faint glow casting shadows across his face. His mind screamed in protest, but deep down, a part of him knew that the lights were more than just lights now. They were something else, something he couldn't control. Then came the most devastating news of all. The bones, the lamps known of it, was truly about the dead. It was about him. And he had unknowingly become a part of their world, one that he couldn't escape. The days blurred into each other, and Nathaniel's mind teetered on the edge of madness. The eerie glow of the lamps had become both his curse and his obsession. His entire world now revolved around the burning, hollowed-out bones of the passengers. He couldn't explain it, but every time the flame from the lamps flickered brighter, his heart quickened, as if their lives lost to the wreckage were somehow still reaching out to him. Each night, he sat by the lamps, staring at the distorted shadows they cast on the wreckage. The whispers came regularly now, indistinguishable voices calling from every corner. They weren't just pleas for recognition, they were demands. Nathaniel could feel it, feel the weight of the forgotten. And as much as he tried to shut them out, the voices refused to be ignored. They were part of him now, as much as the bones he had used to create these damned lamps. The wind had stopped howling weeks ago, leaving only an oppressive stillness that hung like a thick, suffocating fog. Nathaniel had become accustomed to the silence between the voices, the unnatural stillness of his environment. But nothing could prepare him for what he was about to discover. Nothing could prepare him for the truth he had buried in the wreckage all this time. It was a routine night. The lamps burned dimly, their shadows flickering like faint ghosts across the twisted remnants of the train. He had spent hours staring into the fire, trying to decipher the whispers that were now so familiar names, soft cries, but still, nothing made sense. Then, the air shifted. A cold draft swept through the site, sending a chill down his spine. It wasn't the wind, there was no breeze. It was the air itself, suddenly different. Something was moving, something that should have been still. Nathaniel froze, the lamps flickered, the shadows on the walls twisted and contorted, shifting like something alive. He stood, shaking as his eyes darted from one lamp to the next, his pulse pounding in his ears. The shadows began to stretch unnaturally, elongating and then contracting again, as though the very fabric of reality was bending before his eyes. The whispers grew louder, 1,000 voices now, overlapping, as if speaking at once. But this time, it was different. The whispers weren't just speaking to him, they were speaking through him. His body trembled as a deep, unnatural voice, one that he knew wasn't his, spoke aloud, sending chills through his very bones. Who are you?" Nathaniel whispered, his voice cracking. His eyes were wide with panic. The shadow in front of him twisted, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he thought he saw something. A figure, pale, featureless, with glowing eyes standing in the darkness. But it was gone before he could make sense of it. The air crackled again. The whispers ceased, and then nothing. Nathaniel stood alone in the dark, gasping for air, sweat pouring down his face. His chest was tight, his throat dry. What in God's name had just happened? Had he hallucinated? Was it the isolation driving him mad? His breath was heavy, each exhale a cloud of mist in the cold air. Slowly, as if compelled by something he couldn't control, Nathaniel reached down and grabbed the nearest lamp. It burned brightly in his hand, the light scorching the air around him. The bones glowed like they were alive, their pale surfaces radiating an unnatural energy. For a moment, Nathaniel hesitated, but he couldn't stop himself. He stared down at the lamp, and that's when he noticed something he hadn't before. The bones weren't just random. They weren't just thrown together haphazardly. There was a pattern to them, a structure, an organization that made no sense. Nathaniel's heart pounded in his chest. the realization hit him like a tidal wave. The bones were arranged like a map of the wreckage, a map of something far more sinister. As his eyes traced the patterns, the pieces clicked into place. It was impossible to ignore. The remains weren't just bones, they were part of something greater, something planned, something that had been left behind intentionally. This wasn't just the work of an accident. The dead had left a message. But what kind of message? Nathaniel's hands were shaking as he set the lamp down and began to explore the wreckage further. His mind was reeling, his thoughts tangled in confusion and fear. He approached the pile of bones again, his fingers brushing against them. Each touch sent a jolt of electricity through his body, like the bones were alive with energy. Suddenly, his fingers brushed something cold and smooth, something different from the rest. A bone, longer than the others, perfectly intact. He pulled it out slowly, studying it. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just any bone, it was a key unlike anything he had ever seen before, ancient and strange, with intricate carvings etched into its surface. The carvings seemed to pulse, faintly glowing in the dim light of the lamps. Nathaniel's heart raced. He couldn't explain it, but he knew that this bone held the answer to everything, to the whispers, to the lamps, to the dead passengers. This was what they had been trying to tell him. This was their message. The moment his fingers closed around the bone, the world around him seemed to shift. The air grew thick again, the temperature dropping as if he had opened a door to another realm. The lights of the lamps dimmed momentarily, and then a loud, ear-splitting crack rang through the air, so intense that it felt like the earth itself was breaking apart. The light from the lamps exploded into a bright, blinding flare. Nathaniel stumbled back, falling to the ground. His head hit the jagged rocks with a sickening thud, and for a moment, everything went black. When he opened his eyes, the world had changed. The wreckage was gone. The lamps had disappeared. In their place stood something else: a vision, a memory, a glimpse of the past, of what had truly happened on this train. The passengers, their faces, their names, their lives, all flashing before him. And then came the most terrifying realization of all. The crash hadn't been an accident. The train had been deliberately derailed. And Nathaniel? He wasn't just a survivor. He was part of something far darker, something that had been set in motion long before the crash, and he was the one who had just unlocked the door to it. Nathaniel's head ached as he sat, his eyes unfocused, staring at the ground where the wreckage had once sprawled. The key, now cradled in his trembling hand, felt alive, a steady, pulsing energy that thrummed through his veins. It had unlocked something. The knowledge it had brought to him of the crash being no accident, of the passengers' lives snuffed out, deliberately clung to him like a suffocating fog. And yet, despite the weight of what he had uncovered, there was still more to discover. The past wasn't finished with him. He could feel it. The whispers, the voices from the lamps were now incessant, a constant stream of pleading, anguished cries, pulling him back into the world of the forgotten. But this time, their message had changed. They were no longer calling for recognition. Now, they were demanding justice. Justice for what? Nathaniel ran his hand through his disheveled hair, staring at the key. There had to be more. He needed to understand. He had tried to leave, tried to venture into the wilderness in search of answers, but each time he walked away from the wreckage, he felt the oppressive weight of the lamps pulling him back. It was as though they had claimed him, tethering him to this cursed site, to the dead who refused to be forgotten. No matter how far he wandered, the lamps seemed to follow, visible in his mind, their presence like a shadow he couldn't shake. His survival had been a fluke, a chance the universe had given him, but now it felt like he had been marked for something greater, a part of something darker. The very fact that he had survived, that he had managed to create those damn lamps from the Boneshi, had unknowingly summoned something far worse. The light, this light wasn't a gift, it was a curse. He shuddered as the realization washed over him. The key in his hand was no ordinary object. It wasn't just an artifact, it was a beacon, and the more he studied it, the more it seemed to call to him. The carvings on it were strange, symbols that seemed to shift as if they had a mind of their own, a secret language. But the question gnawed at him: what exactly was it calling? The thought of the lamps sent a chill through his spine. They had been nothing more than tools that first tools had used to stave off the cold, the darkness. They were meant to give him warmth, a way to survive. But now, as he looked at the key, it became clear. The lamps were far more than just light. They were conduits. They weren't just lighting up the night, they were awakening something long buried beneath the earth, something ancient, something that had been waiting for the right moment to emerge. Without thinking, Nathaniel stood up, his heart pounding. The key burned in his palm, urging him forward. The night seemed to close in around him, the darkness pressing against him like a suffocating force. He needed answers. He needed to understand what had happened, what he had unleashed. He made his way toward the wreckage once more, driven by an uncontrollable compulsion. The once mangled remains of the train were now oddly still, the twisted metal softened in the dim, otherworldly glow of the lamps. The flames flickered gently, their glow casting long, grotesque shadows. It was almost as if the wreckage itself had become a living thing, part of a cycle that Nathaniel had unwillingly set in motion. Then he saw it, a figure in the shadows, a silhouette standing still in the dark, framed by the flickering lamplight. Nathaniel froze, his breath caught in his throat. The figure was tall, its features indistinct, but Nathaniel could feel its presence. It was not human. It wasn't a ghost either, it was something far worse. The air around it vibrated with an energy he couldn't comprehend, a low hum that made his skin crawl. For a moment, neither of them moved. Nathaniel's hand instinctively tightened around the key. His heart raced, pounding in his chest like a drum. The figure stepped forward, its movement fluid and unnatural, as though it was gliding through the air. It spoke, its voice smooth, almost melodic, but cold like 1,000 voices blending together, all speaking at once. "You have awakened what was meant to remain buried." Nathaniel opened his mouth, but no words came. His legs felt heavy, like they were rooted to the ground. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. His gaze locked onto the figure. What is this?" he managed to croak, his voice hoarse. "What are you?" The figure tilted its head as if considering him. "We are the forgotten," it said. "We have no names, no faces. We are the ones who were erased from memory. You have set us free, but now you will never escape." Nathaniel's stomach churned. This wasn't just some hallucination. This was real. The very thing he had unearthed, the lamps, the bones, the key had all been part of a terrible mistake, a mistake he had made. The figure took another step forward, and Nathaniel could feel an overwhelming weight pressing against him. It was like an invisible force was crushing him from all sides. The whispers, the cries of the forgotten souls were deafening now, reverberating through his skull. His head throbbed with the pain of it. "The lamps you've made are not just your salvation," the figure continued. "They are the prison, the bond. The only way to keep us from returning is to keep them burning. But the longer they burn, the stronger we grow." Nathaniel's eyes widened. The key in his hand pulsed with an answering energy. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice rising, frantic. The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating. "You hold the key," it said, its voice cold as death. "You hold the power to either free us entirely or lock us away forever. But choose wisely, Nathaniel. Once the decision is made, there is no turning back." Nathaniel's breath came in short, shallow gasps. His mind was spinning, his thoughts a tangled mess. The lamps had been his mistake, but they were also his lifeline. The forgotten souls had been trapped in those lamps, but by keeping them lit, he had been keeping them at bay. But what would happen if they were released? What would happen if he made the wrong choice? The figure loomed over him, its cold, unseen gaze burning into his soul. "There is only one way to ensure we do not return, but you must decide now." Nathaniel's heart pounded as he looked down at the key. The weight of his choice crushed him. If he destroyed the lamps, would the souls be freed forever? Or would he trap them and himself in a fate worse than death? But the figure wasn't waiting for his answer. It was already gone, vanishing into the shadows as silently as it had appeared. Nathaniel was left alone, his hands trembling, his mind shattered by the enormity of what he had to decide. The key still pulsed in his hand, as if urging him to make a choice. He had no idea what the right answer was. He only knew one thing: whatever he chose, nothing would ever be the same. Nathaniel's hands shook violently as he stood in the aftermath of the figure's departure. The words it had spoken echoed in his ears, each one a ghostly whisper that felt as if it were etched into his very soul. The lamps were the prison. The lamps were the key. But what did that mean? What did he have to do? The weight of his decision had never felt heavier. The key burned in his palm, a pulsating reminder of the choices ahead. He knew he couldn't simply turn his back on it. He couldn't ignore what was happening. The whispers had grown louder since the moment he had arrived at the wreckage. They were no longer just faint murmurs, they were screams, desperate calls for recognition, for justice. But with the figure's warning still fresh in his mind, the truth began to sink in. There was no escape from what he had started. It was then that Nathaniel realized something else. The lamps weren't merely glowing. They were feeding off the darkness. They were absorbing the very essence of the souls trapped inside them, growing brighter, stronger. But every moment the lamps burned, Every second he allowed them to light the night, they were drawing closer to something far worse than death. The forgotten were growing stronger, and the closer he came to understanding, the more terrifying the consequences seemed. What had he done? He had built these lamps out of bones, the bones of the passengers who had died on this train. But they were never meant to be used like this. They were supposed to be buried, to rest in peace. Instead, he had turned them into something far darker, a conduit for the very souls he had tried to keep at bay. The first lamp, the one he had made in a desperate attempt to light the way, had been the beginning of his nightmare. He had seen its power, felt its warmth, but he had not fully understood what he had unleashed, and now the truth was clear. The lamps weren't just objects, they were vessels, each one a doorway to something ancient and horrifying, something that was never meant to be disturbed. Nathaniel stumbled back from the wreckage, his mind racing. He had to stop. He had to destroy the lamps before it was too late. But the moment the thought crossed his mind, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. He couldn't leave them behind. They needed him. "Remember us," the voices wailed, a chorus of souls bound to the lamps. The flames flickered violently as if in response to the plea. Nathaniel clutched his head, trying to block out the noise. He wanted to scream, to run, but the energy in the air was suffocating, pulling him back to the wreckage. The more he resisted, the more desperate the calls became. The whispers clawed at his mind like hands made of smoke, dragging him back to the place he feared most. He tried to think, tried to reason with himself. Maybe I can destroy the lamps, he thought. Maybe I can burn them, crush them, anything to end this. But something deep inside him hesitated. The lamps had been his only source of light, his only comfort in the darkest moments. They had kept him alive, and now they were all he had left. How could he destroy them? How could he destroy what had become his sole connection to the world? With a reluctant hand, Nathaniel reached down and picked up the first lamp. It had once been just a relic, a crude thing made of shattered bones, but now it felt heavy, burdened with the weight of the dead. He stared at it for a long moment, the flame flickering in the dimness. This is my only way out, he thought. He raised the lamp high, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw something in the flicker of a face, one that he recognized, a face from the wreck, a face of someone who had died in the crash. But before he could react, the lamp seemed to react on its own. The flame flared, nearly blinding him. Nathaniel staggered back, dropping the lamp in the process. It fell to the ground, its flame expanding into an unholy light. The ground beneath him trembled. The air grew thick with the scent of decay. He could hear the bones cracking, the sound reverberating through the air like thunder. The whispers had ceased, replaced by a deafening silence. It felt as if the world itself had stopped spinning, waiting for something to happen, and then it did. The ground split open. The earth cracked wide, a gaping chasm splitting the wreckage. The lamps, their flames now burning with an otherworldly intensity, began to pull at the air. Around them, drawing everything toward them, Nathaniel watched in horror as the lights from the lamps flickered and pulsed like hearts beating in unison. For the first time since the crash, the world around him felt alive in a way that he could never have imagined. The air hummed with a power he didn't understand, and the flames seemed to grow stronger with each passing second. The darkness seemed to reach out, encircling him like a storm. The shadows stretched and warped, growing longer, until they filled every inch of the space around him. It wasn't just the lamps that were drawing the darkness in. It was the lamps that had become the darkness. Nathaniel stumbled back, his heart racing. He could feel it, feel the presence of the dead moving toward him. Their whispers returned, but this time they were no longer pleading. They were angry. They were demanding. They were alive. "Help us," the voices screamed. "You did this. You brought us back. You woke us from our sleep." The ground beneath him continued to crack open, the earth trembling as the chasm widened. A figure appeared at the edge of the darkness. It was tall, towering, and its eyes glowed like embers. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. The figure was wearing the clothes of one of the passengers, its features twisted and broken. It was no longer human, but something far worse. This was its first soul, the first of many. Nathaniel's legs gave out, and he collapsed to the ground. He had no escape. There was no turning back. He had awakened something that would never be put to rest. The figure in the darkness took a step forward, its voice cold and commanding. "You've opened the door, Nathaniel," it said, "and now you will pay the price." The lamps continued to burn, their flames now rising higher and higher, their light filling the darkness with an almost blinding intensity. Nathaniel closed his eyes, knowing that he had crossed the point of no return. The dead were no longer just trapped in the lamps. They were free, and they were coming for him. The ground beneath Nathaniel seemed to pulse with life, the chasm expanding beneath his feet like some great beast awakening from a long slumber. The figure, the first of the dead, towered before him, its glowing eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made Nathaniel's blood run cold. He wanted to move, to run, but his body refused to obey. The whispers, once mere murmurs in the night, now filled his mind with 1,000 voices, each one more desperate than the last. "You woke us," the figure said again, its voice low and guttural, an echo of the souls that had once lived. "You gave us a second chance, Nathaniel, but it's not a gift, it's a curse." Nathaniel swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had thought he was doing the right thing, lighting the lamps, keeping the memory of the dead alive, but now, in the face of this twisted, monstrous presence, he realized how horribly wrong he had been. The flames from the lamps flickered wildly, casting long, distorted shadows across the wreckage. The air itself felt charged, heavy with the energy of the spirits that had been released from their prison. Nathaniel could feel them now surrounding him, their eyes burning into him like 1,000 unseen blades. "You thought you could trap us in these bones?" The figure sneered, stepping closer. "You thought you could use us for your own survival? You can't control us, Nathaniel. You never could." His heart pounded in his chest as the figure loomed over him, its presence overwhelming. The whispers became deafening, now too many voices, too many souls, all speaking at once. He clutched his head in pain, his knees buckling under the weight of the sounds. He couldn't think, he couldn't breathe. How had it come to this? "Please," Nathaniel gasped, his voice strained. "I didn't mean to. Two just wanted to survive. I didn't know what I was doing." The figure's laugh was hollow, cold. "Survival? You think you've survived? You've only delayed the inevitable. We are not just memories. We are not just whispers. We are the consequence of your actions. And now, we're free." The air around him shifted again. A sickening wave of cold washed over him as the whispers grew louder, their words clear now, filled with anger and resentment. Each voice was a lost soul, trapped for eternity, now finally reaching out, demanding justice. Nathaniel's mind reeled as the flames from the lamps intensified, their light blinding, their heat suffocating. The figure reached out, its hand a twisted mockery of human form, its fingers clawed and elongated. "You will suffer the same fate," the figure hissed. "You will be forgotten, just as we were. Your name will be erased from time, your memory lost. You are already one of us." Nathaniel stumbled back, his heart racing. He knew that the figure was telling the truth. The lamps, the bones, the key he had unwittingly set everything into motion. The spirits were now free, and their anger was directed solely at him. They had been trapped in the lamps for so long, and now they wanted revenge. But as the figure advanced on him, something unexpected happened. The ground cracked once more, but this time, it wasn't just the earth splitting. Something else, something darker began to rise from the chasm. A mass of shadow and flame, swirling, twisting, coalescing into a form that made Nathaniel's blood run cold. It was not human. It was something far older, far more dangerous. A second figure. It stood taller than the first, its body made of pure darkness, its face obscured by an endless void. Its presence radiated an overwhelming power, a malevolent force that seemed to reach into Nathaniel's very soul. The whispers faded for a moment, replaced by a deafening silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. The first figure froze, its glowing eyes locking onto the new entity. A shudder ran through the air, the temperature dropping, as if the very world was reacting to the arrival of this new force. "Who dares to interfere?" The first figure growled, its voice trembling with fear. The second figure spoke, its voice a low, resonant growl that vibrated the air around them. "You are no longer in control. The balance has shifted." Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. This new figure, whatever it was not part of the souls he had awakened. It was something else, something ancient, and it was here to take control. The first figure seemed to recoil, stepping back as if recognizing the true power of the being before it. The shadows around them seemed to bow, acknowledging its dominance. "The balance?" The first figure spat, its anger palpable. "What do you mean, balance?" The second figure stepped closer, its form shifting and changing with every movement, like smoke in the wind. "You were never meant to be free. You were never meant to rise from the earth. You were a mistake, a consequence of a greater force." Nathaniel's mind reeled. What was happening? Who was this new figure? Why was it here? The second figure's glowing eyes turned to Nathaniel, and for the first time, Nathaniel felt truly powerless. The weight of the spirit's gaze crushed him, pinning him to the ground. "You were the one who woke them," the figure said, its voice cold and unfeeling. "And now, you will see the true cost of your actions." Before Nathaniel could react, the ground beneath him trembled again. The lamps flared brightly and the air grew heavier. A new sound, one that he couldn't quite place, began to rise like a low hum, vibrating the very earth. It wasn't a voice, but a force that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. Then, the figure spoke again, its voice sharp, demanding. "It is time to make a choice, Nathaniel. You can't hide from it anymore." Nathaniel's mind raced. The whispers had ceased, the lamps had gone dim, their light flickering erratically. The first figure was no longer moving, its form frozen in place. It was as if the arrival of the second entity had drained the life from it. A terrifying realization gripped Nathaniel. The first figure had been nothing more than a tool, a pawn. The second figure of this ancient, malevolent force was the true power. And now, it wanted something from him. It was waiting for him to make a decision. What choice, he thought. What could I possibly choose now? The second figure's eyes narrowed, as if sensing his thoughts. "You've awoken us, and now you must decide. Will you end it, or will you allow us to reign again?" Nathaniel looked between the two figures, their power radiating outward, their presence suffocating. The weight of his actions had never felt so heavy, and yet, as he stood there, paralyzed by fear, he understood something terrible. There was no escape from this. There was no redemption. He had awoken the forgotten, and now they would have their vengeance. But what did the second figure mean by ending it? Could he destroy the lamps? Could he return everything to the darkness, or would that make it worse? His thoughts spiraled out of control until suddenly everything stopped. The whispers, the shadows, the power, all of it. And then came the most devastating realization of all. The choice wasn't his. The ground trembled beneath Nathaniel's feet, the darkness surrounding him now a living thing, pulsing with an energy he could barely comprehend. The first figurante's vengeful soul was now frozen, motionless, as if it had been consumed by the overwhelming force that had just emerged from the chasm. The second figure, the ancient shadowy entity, loomed over him, its presence suffocating. Its gaze burned through him, as if it could see every terrible thought, every dark secret hidden within his soul. The air was thick with the hum of energy, vibrating through Nathaniel's bones. His body felt like it was being crushed, weighed down by an invisible force. The weight of the world, of his choices, pressed in on him, and he could barely breathe. The whispers had stopped. The dead had gone silent, but their presence lingered, their anger palpable in the silence that hung around him. The ancient figure's voice cut through the stillness, deep and resonant. "You thought the light would save you, Nathaniel, but the light is what bound you, and now it is what will destroy you." Nathaniel's mind raced. The lamps, the Bonish's only means of survival. They had been his refuge, his lifeline, in the face of death. But now, they were his prison. He had been warned. The lamps were not just vessels of light, they were traps. They were anchors that kept the spirits, the forgotten, bound to this place. The figure stepped closer, its form shifting with each movement, swirling like smoke. "You used them," it continued. "You used the bones of the dead, their lives, to light your way. And now they demand a price." Nathaniel's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. "I didn't know," he whispered hoarsely. "I didn't know what I was doing. I never meant for it to be like this." The figure laughed, the sound echoing like thunder. "You did not know, but that does not absolve you. The light you created has been feeding off the dead, and the more it burns, the more it draws us to this world. You cannot control it any longer. You cannot stop what has been set in motion." Suddenly the lamps flared brighter, their flames dancing wildly. The ground beneath Nathaniel's feet cracked open again, and he fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the force of it all. The energy was too much to bear. He could feel the presence of the dead growing stronger, their souls reaching out from the very bones that had once been their bodies. Their cries, their suffering, filled his ears, growing louder, more frantic with every passing second. The figure's voice grew colder. "The price has already been paid. You will be consumed by the very darkness you've unleashed. The light will burn until nothing is left." Nathaniel's mind spun. He could feel the flames from the lamps pulling him in, like an unseen hand tugging at him, drawing him closer to the void. The earth continued to crack, the chasm widening, as if it were a gateway to another realm, a place where the forgotten would finally be free. But Nathaniel understood now, it wasn't freedom, it was annihilation. The dead didn't just want release, they wanted vengeance. They wanted him. A sudden thought struck him, sharp and desperate. The key, the bone he had found. The key had to be the answer. It had to be. He reached for it, his fingers trembling as he grasped the cold, smooth surface. The moment he touched it, the light from the lamps flickered violently, as if in response to his touch. The ground beneath him shook violently, the energy rising higher, more intense. The figure observed him with an air of quiet amusement. "Do you think that bone will save you? Do you think it will undo what has been done? You are already lost, Nathaniel. The light is the price, and you cannot escape it." But Nathaniel was not listening. He raised the key high, the glow from the lamps intensifying as he did. The whispers were deafening now, their voices a cacophony of fury and despair, but he pushed them out of his mind, focusing on the key in his hand. With a cry of desperation, Nathaniel drove the key into the ground, stabbing it into the earth itself. The moment it touched the soil, the world seemed to stop. The lamps went dark. For a heartbeat, everything was still. The chasm that had split the ground ceased its rumbling, and the oppressive air lifted. The weight pressing down on him vanished. He could feel the presence of the figure, but its power had waned. The flames from the lamps had gone out, leaving nothing but the dim light of the dying fire. Nathaniel's heart hammered in his chest as he dared to look up. The ancient figure's form seemed to flicker, unstable. The ground trembled again, but this time, it wasn't a violent quake. It was a tremor, a soft pulse, like the last lingering remnants of a storm. The figure took a step back, its form wavering. "You," it began, but the words faltered as if they were being pulled away, consumed by the very light Nathaniel had created. Nathaniel collapsed to the ground, exhausted, the key still in his hand. The whispers had faded, leaving behind an eerie silence. The air was no longer thick with energy, it was still, calm, as if the world were holding its breath. The lamps were gone. The darkness that had threatened to swallow him was receding, leaving nothing but the cold silence of the wreckage behind. But the figure wasn't gone. It was still there, its eyes burning through the dim light. "You may have silenced us for now," it whispered, "but you cannot undo what you have done. The light will return, and when it does, we will be here, waiting." Nathaniel looked at the key in his hand, its power finally spent. The lamp's flame had flickered one last time, and with it, the dead had faded back into the shadows. For now, he didn't know how long the peace would last. The price of the light, the price of the souls, had been paid. But for now, in the silence that followed, Nathaniel was left alone with the wreckage, the echoes of the forgotten still whispering in the dark corners of his mind. Nathaniel stood in the remains of the wreckage, the silence deafening. The ground beneath him was no longer cracked open. The chasm that had threatened to swallow him had sealed itself. The once violent whispers of the dead had faded, leaving only the hollow sound of his own breath echoing in the cold, lifeless air. The lamps were gone. The Bonaki had been driven into the earth, severing the tether between the souls and the world they had haunted. The flames had gone out, the light extinguished, and with it, the darkness that had consumed him began to recede. But as the moments passed, Nathaniel could feel something in the air. Something wasn't quite right. The stillness was unsettling. It was too quiet, too calm. The wind barely moved, and the moonlight seemed unnaturally dim. He had expected a sense of peace, of finality, but instead, a strange tension hung over him, as if something was waiting, watching, from the shadows. Nathaniel turned, his eyes scanning the empty landscape. The wreckage lay still before him, but a feeling of unease crept over him, one he couldn't shake. He could still feel them. The dead, the forgotten. He could feel their presence, even if their voices had stopped. Was it over? Then came the sound. It was faint at first, like a soft breeze, but it grew louder, until the whispers returned, this time not as distant cries, but as clear and direct as ever. His heart skipped a beat. The whispers weren't tea in his head. They were real, circling him once again. The ground trembled lightly, and a shadow moved, a figure emerging from the darkness. Nathaniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was him, the first figure, the one who had warned him, the soul of a passenger who had once been lost in the wreck. But now, there was something different about it. The figure's form was no longer bound by the energy of the lamps. It had shifted, become something more. The figure's face was no longer twisted in anger or hatred. It was calm, composed, almost serene, but still distorted, as though it no longer fully belonged to this world. "You," Nathaniel whispered, his voice hoarse. I thought I destroyed you." The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. "You cannot destroy what is already forgotten, Nathaniel. You merely delayed it." Its voice was soft, but there was an unmistakable finality in its words. "You may have extinguished the lamps, but you cannot extinguish us. We are the forgotten, and we will always return." Nathaniel's chest tightened. He had thought the key, the lamps, the bone, everything he had done had closed the door. But now, standing before the figure, he realized that the dead had never truly been gone. They were never meant to stay locked away. You're not free, Nathaniel said, his voice shaking. None of you are. The figure's hollow eyes glowed faintly, and it smiled, an expression that seemed both mournful and terrifying. No, Nathaniel, it said softly. It is you who is not free. You opened the door, you woke us, and now you must live with the consequences. A chill ran through Nathaniel's body. The realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. He hadn't merely awakened the dead or the spirits trapped in the lamps. He had made himself a part of their world, a world that existed beyond life and death, and no matter what he did, he would never escape it. You cannot escape, the figure continued, its voice now a whisper in the wind. You will always hear us, always feel us. Your fate is tied to the forgotten now, bound by your choices. You open the door, and we will remain with you. The figure's form began to dissipate, the shadows wrapping around it as if it were being drawn back into the earth. But before it vanished completely, it spoke one last time. We are the forgotten. We never leave. Nathaniel was left standing in the wreckage, his legs trembling beneath him. The figure was gone, but its words echoed in his mind, haunting him, reverberating through the empty space around him. The air felt colder now, heavier with the weight of his actions. The lamps were gone. The bone had been driven into the earth. The light had been extinguished. But the spirits the forgotten were still there, waiting, lingering in the shadows. They weren't free. They would never be. And neither would he. Nathaniel staggered back, his breath shallow, his body consumed by the overwhelming realization that he had unleashed something he could never put back. The silence that followed the figure's disappearance wasn't comforting. It was the silence of something waiting, something that would never truly fade away. As the night wore on, Nathaniel stood alone, the wreckage of the train before him, the weight of the forgotten pressing down on his soul. There was no escape. The spirits had returned. They had always been here, and now so was he forever bound to the darkness. And in that silence he understood. The price of the light had never been just his soul. It was the very world around him, the memory of the date, and it would haunt him until the end of his days. The silence was suffocating. Nathaniel stood in the wreckage, feeling the weight of the forgotten pressing down on him. The cold of the night had grown unbearable, but it wasn't the chill in the air that was suffocating him. It was the knowledge that the dead weren't done with him. They had never left. His body felt numb, the weight of his choices, the hours spent sitting by the extinguished lamps, the whispers that never stopped. They had all led to this. The broken souls of the dead were now a part of him. He had been the one to unleash them, to awaken their hunger for recognition. And now, they were no longer trapped in the lamps. They were free to haunt him for as long as they wished. The ground beneath him shifted. Once again, and Nathaniel's heart raced. He had thought the nightmare was over when the lamps went dark. He had thought the dead had returned to their resting places, their suffering ended. But this was worse than any darkness he had faced. He was no longer alone. The figure appeared again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just the first figure. It was something else, something more terrifying. Shadows writhed around the form, thick and black, as if the darkness itself had been given shape. You think it's over? The voice was a low growl, distant yet clear, reverberating through his bones. Nathaniel stumbled backward, his pulse quickening. I thought I could end it. I thought I had. The figure moved closer, the air turning heavy, as if every step it took crushed the very ground beneath it. You don't get to end it, Nathaniel. You've set the stage for the beginning of something much worse. The ground cracked open beneath his feet again, the chasm yawning wider. From the depths, more figures emerged. More souls, more faces from the wreck, twisted and contorted with pain and rage. They were no longer mere shadows. They had form. They were alive with fury, their faces frozen in eternal anguish. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. No, this can't be happening. I thought you could silence us. The figure's voice dripped with disdain. You thought you could lock us away with your bones, with your lamps? You awakened us, and now we'll never be forgotten. The figures advanced, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. They were everywhere, surrounding him, their whispers turning into screams, their suffering endless. The air was thick with it. Every shadow that stretched out seemed to reach for him, pulling him closer to the abyss. Nathaniel fell to his knees, the weight of the spirits pressing down on him. The ground beneath him seemed to give way, and he could feel himself being pulled into the depths of the chasm, the forgotten souls dragging him down. But then, everything stopped. The ground went still. The whispers quieted. A different presence filled the air, something familiar but foreign at the same time. Nathaniel looked up, his heart pounding. The figure, the first one, the one who had been silent all this time, stepped forward. You've done enough, it said softly. For the first time, Nathaniel didn't feel fear. He felt relief. The figure's voice echoed through the air. "Now it's time for you to leave. You're no longer a part of this." And just like that, everything went dark. The darkness was absolute. Nathaniel's body was numb, his mind clouded, but in the void, one thing remained clear: the weight of the forgotten. He could feel their presence, their endless hunger surrounding him, pressing in from every side. Then, a light flickered. It wasn't the light of the lamps. It wasn't the glow of the bones. This was something different, something colder. It was a pale, fragile light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Nathaniel looked up, his breath catching in his throat. The figure stood before him once again, its eyes glowing faintly. "You didn't think you were done, did you?" The figure's voice was soft, almost pitying. Nathaniel opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He understood now dead weren't gone. The light had never been the escape he thought it was. The light had always been a part of the curse, the tether that kept the forgotten from truly fading. The figure stepped closer, and the ground beneath Nathaniel's feet seemed to dissolve. He could hear the dead calling, their voices like 1,000 shattered echoes in his mind. "This is your end," the figure said, its voice no longer soft but sharp, cold as ice. "Not in the way you think." The light burned brighter, filling the void, and Nathaniel understood the terrible truth. The dead didn't need to be freed, they needed to be remembered. The final twist was the forgotten now. The figure's eyes glowed one last time, a flash of red, and then the light was gone. Nathaniel was left in the cold, silent darkness. His story would never be told, never remembered. He was lost, just like the souls he had tried to save, and in the silence he was finally, irrevocably, forgotten. Final payoff: Nathaniel's body remained still in the wreckage, his name forgotten by time, his story erased from history. The lamps had gone dark, the whispers ceased, but the cost of his actions lingered in the cold air, an eternal reminder of the price paid for the light. The forgotten souls were no longer bound to the earth, but they weren't free either. They returned to the shadows where their cries would echo forever, and Nathaniel was left behind, a fleeting memory swallowed by the darkness. His name would never be spoken again, his face would never be remembered. The train crash, the bones, the lampshade would all fade into nothing, forgotten by everyone but the spirits he had tried to save. And as time passed, even their voices would become just another whisper, another lost story, vanishing into the silence of the forgotten.